The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and distant smoke across the high country as Jacob Rawlins guided his mare up the narrow trail toward his cabin. 3 years he had lived in these mountains, and 3 years he had preferred the company of silence to the chatter of townfolk. The cabin sat tucked against a granite outcrop, its weathered logs blending into the landscape like it had grown there naturally. Behind it, a small stream tumbled down from the peaks, providing fresh water and the gentle sound that helped him sleep on restless nights. Jacob was a man shaped by solitude and hard work. His hands were rough from splitting wood and mending fence, his face weathered by sun and wind. At 32, he moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned that wasted motion could mean the difference between comfort and hardship in the wilderness. His dark hair hung past his collar, and a thick beard covered most of his face, making his pale blue eyes seem like chips of winter sky. He had come to these mountains after the war, carrying wounds that went deeper than the scar across his left shoulder, where a Confederate bullet had found its mark. The cabin had been abandoned then, left by a prospector who had given up on finding gold in the nearby creek. Jacob had spent his first winter rebuilding the roof and chinkling the gaps between the logs. By spring, he had made it into something that felt like home, or as close to home as he figured he would ever need. The work suited him. He trapped in winter, hunted when he needed meat, and grew a small garden behind the cabin during the short mountain summers. Twice a year he would ride down to the settlement of Pine Ridge, a day's journey through the winding valleys, to trade furs for supplies and ammunition. The townspeople knew him as a quiet man who paid his debts and caused no trouble. They respected his desire to be left alone. That evening, as he settled into his routine of preparing dinner and checking his traps, Jacob noticed something that made him pause. A shadow moved across the window of his cabin, cast by the light of his oil lamp. But when he looked outside, he saw nothing. The forest stood quiet in the gathering dusk, with only the usual sounds of wind in the pines and the distant call of an owl. He convinced himself it had been a branch swaying in the breeze, or perhaps a cloud passing over the moon. Such tricks of light were common in the mountains, where shadows could play strange games with a man's eyes. He finished his meal of venison and beans, cleaned his rifle, and went to bed thinking no more about it. The next evening, it happened again. This time he was certain. The shadow was too distinct, too human in shape to be anything natural. It moved slowly across the window, paused as if looking in, then disappeared. Jacob grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, scanning the darkness. The moon was half full, providing enough light to see the open ground around his cabin, but whoever had cast the shadow was gone. He spent an hour searching the area, looking for tracks or any sign of an intruder. The soft earth near his woodpile showed the prints of deer and his own boots, but nothing else. When he finally went back inside, he checked the load in his rifle and placed it within easy reach of his bed. In this country, a man learned to be cautious about uninvited visitors. The pattern continued for a week. Every evening, just as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks and Jacob lit his lamp, the shadow would appear. It would move slowly across the window, always from left to right, pause at the center, then fade away. Jacob began timing it, noting that it happened at almost exactly the same time each night. On the 8th night, he was ready. He had positioned himself near the window with his rifle, keeping the lamp burning but staying in the shadows himself. When the familiar silhouette appeared on the glass, he was watching from an angle that let him see outside. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a figure barely visible in the moonlight. Even at a distance, he could tell it was a woman. She stood perfectly still, her long hair hanging loose around her shoulders, her dress reaching nearly to the ground. She seemed to be looking directly at his cabin, though from his position he could not see her face. After what felt like several minutes, she turned and melted back into the forest like smoke. Jacob remained at the window for another hour, but she did not return. When he finally went to bed, his mind raced with questions. Who was she? What did she want? And why did she come every night only to watch and leave? The next morning he searched the spot where she had stood. The ground was covered with fallen leaves and pine needles, making it difficult to find clear tracks, but he managed to locate a few partial footprints. They were small, probably made by moccasins rather than boots. The realization sent a chill through him. This was Apache country, though he had never seen any of the tribe in the 3 years he had lived here. Jacob knew the stories that circulated in Pine Ridge about Apache raids and kidnappings. Most of the settlers viewed any Apache with suspicion and fear, but he also knew that many of those stories were exaggerated or outright false, spread by men who had never actually encountered the people they claimed to fear. During his service in the Army before the war had called him east, he had spent time at frontier posts where he had learned that the Apache were not the savage monsters that fearful settlers made them out to be. They were people trying to survive in a land that was being overrun by strangers. Still, a lone woman watching his cabin every night was puzzling and potentially dangerous. That afternoon, he decided to ride down to Pine Ridge to see if anyone knew anything about Apache activity in the area. The trail wound through stands of aspen that had turned golden with the season, their leaves shimmering in the mountain breeze. It was beautiful country, but Jacob found himself checking his back trail more often than usual. Pine Ridge consisted of a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and about 24 houses scattered along both sides of a dirt road that paralleled Pine Creek. It was not much of a town, but it served the needs of the ranchers, prospectors, and trappers who worked the surrounding valleys. Jacob tied his horse in front of Murphy's general store and went inside. Sean Murphy, a stout Irishman with graying hair, looked up from his ledger book and nodded a greeting. "Jacob Rawlins, good to see you. Little early for your usual supply run, isn't it? Wanted to ask you something, Sean. You heard any talk about Apache in the high country lately?" Murphy's expression grew serious. "Apache? Can't say that I have. Why? You seen sign of them up your way?" Jacob hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Maybe. Thought I saw someone watching my place. Wanted to know if there had been any trouble." "Nothing that I've heard. Course, most of the Apache moved south years ago when the Army started pushing them. There might be a few small bands still in the mountains, but they generally don't bother folks who don't bother them." Murphy leaned across the counter, lowering his voice. "You know, there's an old-timer named Charlie Blackwood who comes in here sometimes. Used to scout for the Army before they transferred all the troops east for the war. He knows more about the Apache than anybody around here. Might be worth talking to him." "Where would I find him?" "He's got a cabin about 5 miles south of here, up Willow Creek. But Jacob, if you're having trouble with Apache, maybe you ought to consider moving closer to town. Lots safer." Jacob shook his head. "I'm not ready to give up my place yet. Thanks for the information, Sean." He left the store and rode south along the creek until he found the narrow trail that led to Blackwood's cabin. The old scout was splitting wood when Jacob arrived, moving with the careful precision of a man well into his 60s but still strong. His hair was completely white, and his face was deeply lined from years in the sun, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "You'd be Rawlins," Blackwood said, setting down his axe. "Heard about you. Man who lives up on Granite Creek." "That's right. Sean Murphy said you might be able to help me with some questions about the Apache." Blackwood studied him for a moment, then gestured toward a couple of stumps that served as chairs. "Sit. Tell me what's troubling you." Jacob explained about the nightly visits, describing what he had observed without mentioning his own growing curiosity about the woman's identity. When he finished, Blackwood was quiet for several minutes, staring off toward the mountains. "Could be several things," the old scout finally said. "Might be someone scouting your place for a raid, though that doesn't sound likely given the pattern you describe." Apache don't usually waste time with reconnaissance that takes weeks. When they decide to hit a place, they do it quick. He paused, stroking his white beard thoughtfully. "More likely, it's someone who's curious about you but afraid to approach directly. Could be a woman who's been cast out of her tribe, trying to survive on her own. That's dangerous country for anyone alone, especially a woman." "Cast out? For what?" "Lots of reasons. Maybe she married outside the tribe or broke some important custom. Could be her family was killed and she has nowhere else to go. Apache society is complicated, Rawlins. There are rules and traditions that outsiders don't understand." Blackwood leaned forward, his expression serious. "If I were you, I'd try to make contact. Not aggressive-like, but let her know you're not a threat. Apache are proud people, but they're also practical. If she's been watching your place for weeks without causing trouble, she's probably not planning any." "How would I go about that?" "Food," Blackwood said immediately. "Set some food out where she can find it, but where it's clear you left it intentionally. Cooked meat, maybe some bread if you have it. Don't try to hide and watch. Just leave it and go about your business. If she's hungry enough, she'll take it. If she takes it, leave more." Jacob considered this. It made sense, though the idea of intentionally attracting an Apache woman to his cabin went against everything he had been told about frontier safety. "One more thing," Blackwood added. "Learn a few words of Apache if you can. Even just hello and friend might make a difference. Shows respect." The old scout taught him the pronunciation of several basic Apache words, making Jacob repeat them until he got them right. The language was unlike anything he had heard before, with sounds that seemed to flow like water over stones. He rode back to his cabin as the sun was setting, arriving just in time for the woman's usual appearance. This time, instead of watching from inside, he stepped out onto his small porch and simply stood there, making no threatening moves. The shadow appeared on his window as expected, but when he looked toward the forest edge, he could see her more clearly. She was younger than he had expected, probably in her 20s. Her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders, and she wore what appeared to be a traditional Apache dress decorated with shells or beads that caught the moonlight. She stood perfectly still, watching him watch her. Jacob raised his hand slowly, palm outward, in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she raised her own hand in response before disappearing back into the trees. The gesture gave him hope. Tomorrow, he would try Blackwood's suggestion about the food. The next evening, before lighting his lamp, Jacob placed a tin plate with cooked venison and fresh biscuits on the tree stump at the edge of his clearing. He had positioned it where it would be clearly visible to anyone watching from the forest, but far enough from the cabin that the woman would not feel trapped if she decided to approach. He went back inside and lit his lamp, then sat at his table where he could see the plate through his window. The woman appeared at her usual time, and he could see her looking at the food. She did not approach immediately, but seemed to be studying the offering and perhaps trying to determine if it was a trap. After about 10 minutes, she moved slowly across the clearing. Even in the dim light, Jacob could see that she was thin, probably underfed. She approached the stump carefully, constantly watching the cabin. When she reached the food, she picked up the plate and retreated quickly into the forest. Jacob felt a sense of satisfaction. Blackwood had been right. The next evening, he put out more food, this time adding a cup of coffee that was still warm. Again, she took it. On the third night, he added a piece of hard candy, the kind children in town particularly enjoyed. By the end of the week, a routine had been established. Jacob would put out food. The woman would wait until she was sure it was safe, then take it back into the forest. She was always careful, always alert, but she no longer seemed afraid of him. On the 8th night, after he had started leaving food, Jacob decided to try something different. Instead of going back inside after placing the plate on the stump, he sat down on his porch steps, far enough away that she would not feel threatened, but close enough that she could see he meant her no harm. When she appeared at the forest edge, she stopped when she saw him. They looked at each other across the clearing for what seemed like a very long time. Then Jacob spoke one of the Apache words Blackwood had taught him. "Dagoti," he said quietly. The word meant hello or greetings. The woman's head tilted slightly, as if she had not expected to hear her own language from this mountain hermit. After a moment, she responded with the same word, her voice barely carrying across the clearing. It was the first time Jacob had heard her speak, and the sound sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. Her voice was soft but clear, with the musical quality he had noticed in the Apache language when Blackwood had taught him the words. She approached the food more slowly that night, pausing several times to look at him. When she reached the stump, she picked up the plate but did not immediately retreat. Instead, she spoke again, a longer phrase that Jacob could not understand, but that sounded like a question. He spread his hands and shook his head, indicating that he did not understand. Then he tried another Apache word Blackwood had taught him. "Shikai," he said, "friend." The woman stood very still, and Jacob thought he saw something change in her posture. The wariness remained, but some of the tension seemed to leave her shoulders. She nodded once, then spoke what sounded like the same word back to him before disappearing into the forest. That night, Jacob lay in bed thinking about her voice and the way she had said the word for friend. For the first time since coming to the mountains, he felt something besides contentment with his solitary life. He felt curiosity, and something else he could not quite name. The next morning brought the first snow of the season, a light dusting that made the world look clean and new. Jacob spent the day checking his traps and splitting additional firewood, but his thoughts kept returning to the woman in the forest. Was she warm enough? Did she have adequate shelter for the coming winter? These concerns surprised him. He had chosen this isolated life partly to avoid worrying about other people. Yet here he was, concerned about a stranger who might or might not be Apache, who might or might not mean him harm. That evening, he put out not just food, but also a wool blanket, one of his spare ones that was still in good condition. It would help keep her warm as the weather grew colder. When she appeared and saw the blanket, she examined it carefully before picking it up along with the food. Before leaving, she looked toward the porch where Jacob sat and spoke several words that sounded like gratitude. The pattern continued as October turned to November and the snows came more frequently. Jacob found himself looking forward to their brief encounters. Even though they rarely involved more than a few words and the exchange of food for what he had come to think of as companionship. He learned a few more Apache words from memory, things Blackwood had mentioned during their conversation. She seemed pleased when he attempted her language, though she often corrected his pronunciation with gentle repetition until he got it right. One evening in late November, when the snow was falling steadily and the wind was sharp with winter, she did not come at her usual time. Jacob waited on the porch until well past midnight, growing increasingly worried. Had something happened to her? Had she finally moved on to find better shelter for the winter? He spent a restless night wondering about her absence and was relieved when she appeared the next evening. But something was different. Even in the moonlight, he could see that she moved more slowly, and when she bent to pick up the food, she seemed unsteady. Without thinking, Jacob stood up and called out to her. "Wait," he said, both in English and in the Apache word Blackwood had taught him for stop. She froze, clearly startled that he had spoken directly to her rather than simply letting her take the food and leave. They stared at each other across the clearing, and Jacob could see that she was indeed unwell. Her movements were sluggish, and she seemed to be having difficulty staying upright. Making a decision that surprised even himself, Jacob slowly descended the porch steps and began walking toward her. She watched him approach with wide eyes but did not flee. When he was close enough to see her clearly in the moonlight, he realized that she was sick, probably feverish. "Sick," he said, first in English, then tried to remember if Blackwood had taught him any words related to illness or injury. The woman nodded weakly and said something in Apache that he interpreted as agreement. She swayed slightly, and Jacob instinctively reached out to steady her. The contact surprised them both, but she did not pull away. Up close, Jacob could see that she was indeed young, probably not much older than 25. Her face was beautiful in the way of her people, with high cheekbones and intelligent dark eyes, but it was flushed with fever and drawn with exhaustion. "Come," he said, gesturing toward his cabin. "Warm, food, medicine." She looked toward the cabin, then back at his face, clearly weighing the risks of trusting this stranger against the danger of remaining outside in her condition. Finally, she nodded. Jacob helped the woman toward his cabin, moving slowly to match her unsteady pace. She leaned against him more heavily than he expected, confirming his suspicion that she was quite ill. When they reached the porch, she hesitated again, looking at the doorway as if crossing that threshold would change everything. "Safe," Jacob said, using both English and the Apache word Blackwood had taught him. He opened the door and stepped aside, letting her enter first so she would not feel trapped. The warmth of the cabin seemed to revive her slightly. She stood in the center of the single room, taking in his simple furnishings. The rough wooden table, the stone fireplace with its crackling fire, the narrow bed in the corner, and the shelves lined with books, supplies, and trapping equipment. Her eyes lingered on the books, as if surprised to find them in such a remote place. Jacob gestured toward the chair beside the fireplace, the most comfortable seat in the cabin. She sat down gratefully, pulling the wool blanket he had given her several weeks earlier more tightly around her shoulders. Now that they were in better light, he could see that she was indeed quite sick. Her face was flushed with fever, and she shivered despite the warmth of the fire. "Water," he said, bringing her a cup from his water bucket. She drank it slowly, studying his face over the rim of the cup. When she had finished, Jacob knelt beside the fireplace and began preparing tea using herbs he had learned to gather from the mountains. His mother had taught him basic remedies before her death, and years of living alone had forced him to expand that knowledge. As the tea steeped, he heated water in his largest pot for a warm compress. The woman watched everything he did with careful attention, as if memorizing his movements. When he approached with the warm cloth, she tensed slightly, but allowed him to place it against her forehead. The fever was quite high, and Jacob worried that she had been struggling with illness for days before finally becoming too weak to hide it from him. No wonder she had seemed unsteady the previous evening. "Name?" he asked, pointing to himself. "Jacob." She considered this for a long moment, then spoke slowly. "Ayana." The name was beautiful, flowing like water over stone. Jacob repeated it carefully, and she smiled for the first time since he had been watching her. The expression transformed her face, revealing a warmth that her earlier wariness had hidden. "Ayana," Jacob said again, then gestured around the cabin. "Stay, rest, get well." She understood his meaning even if she did not know all the English words. After finishing the herbal tea, she leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes. The combination of warmth, safety, and medicine seemed to be helping already. Jacob prepared a simple meal of soup and biscuits, food that would be easy for a sick person to digest. When Ayana opened her eyes, the smell of cooking seemed to revive her interest. She had probably not eaten a proper hot meal in weeks. As she ate slowly, Jacob found himself studying her more closely than he had dared when she was standing at the forest edge. Her dress was beautifully made, decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns he had never seen before. The materials were of good quality, suggesting that she came from a family of some importance within her tribe. What had brought her to this isolated valley, living alone in the wilderness? After the meal, Ayanna's eyelids grew heavy. Jacob made a bed for her on the floor near the fireplace, using his spare blankets and his own pillow. She protested weakly, clearly not wanting to take his bed, but he insisted. When she finally lay down, she was asleep within minutes. Jacob sat at his table pretending to read, but actually watching over his unexpected guest. Having another person in his cabin felt strange after 3 years of solitude, but not unpleasant. The sound of her quiet breathing added something to the silence that he had not realized was missing. During the night, her fever worsened. Jacob woke several times to check on her, changing the compress on her forehead and giving her water when she would take it. Toward dawn, she began speaking in her sleep, rapid Apache phrases that sounded urgent or distressed. She seemed to be reliving some difficult memory, and once she called out what sounded like a name. By morning, the fever had broken. Ayanna woke slowly, looking around the cabin with momentary confusion before remembering where she was. Jacob, who had spent most of the night dozing in his chair, woke when he heard her stirring. "Better?" he asked. She nodded, sitting up carefully. The flush was gone from her cheeks, and her eyes were clearer. She spoke several words in Apache, and though Jacob could not understand them, her tone suggested gratitude. Over the next few days, Ayanna remained in the cabin as she recovered her strength. Jacob continued sleeping in the chair, giving her the privacy and comfort of his bed. During the day, they began the careful process of learning to communicate. Jacob's few Apache words and Ayanna's limited English created a unique language between them, supplemented by gestures and drawings in the ashes of the fireplace. She was clearly intelligent and learned new English words quickly. In return, she taught him more Apache, correcting his pronunciation with patient repetition. On the third day, when she was feeling well enough to sit at the table, Ayanna began telling Jacob her story through their combination of words and gestures. It came out slowly, in pieces, but gradually he began to understand what had brought her to his valley. Her Apache name was Ayanna, which meant eternal blossom. She came from a band that had traditionally lived in the mountains to the south, but her people had been forced to move several times as white settlements expanded. Her family had been killed in a raid by soldiers 2 years earlier, when she was 23. The raid had been in retaliation for attacks on wagon trains, though her family had not been involved in those attacks. After losing her family, Ayanna had been taken in by relatives. But the arrangement had not worked well. Her uncle had tried to arrange a marriage for her to a man she did not respect, someone who drank too much and treated women poorly. When she had refused the marriage, it had created problems within the band. The situation had grown worse when she had been caught teaching some of the children to read English using a Bible that had belonged to a missionary. Some of the tribal elders viewed this as a betrayal of Apache traditions, while others saw it as a practical skill that might help their people survive in a changing world. The final crisis had come when she had helped a wounded Mexican trader who had stumbled into their camp. She had given him water and tended his injuries, despite the fact that her people had been at war with Mexican forces. Some of the warriors had wanted to kill the trader, but Ayanna had argued for mercy, saying that healing was women's work and should not be subject to the politics of war. Her uncle had finally told her that she brought too much trouble to the band and that she should leave. With nowhere else to go, she had spent the summer and early fall living alone in the mountains, surviving on her knowledge of edible plants, small game she could trap, and occasionally fish from mountain streams. She had discovered Jacob's cabin several weeks ago and had been watching him to determine what kind of man he was. She had seen that he lived simply, hurt no one, and seemed to be at peace with the land. When hunger had driven her to accept the food he offered, she had begun to hope that perhaps she had found someone who might not judge her for the choices she had made. Jacob listened to her story with growing understanding and respect. She had been cast out for showing mercy and for trying to prepare children for a changing world. In his opinion, these were signs of wisdom and compassion, not betrayal. Using their developing communication system, he told her about his own story, the war, the wounds both physical and emotional, his decision to leave civilization behind for the peace of the mountains. He spoke about the loneliness he had thought he wanted, and how her presence had made him realize that complete isolation might not be the answer he had thought it was. As November turned to December and the snow grew deeper, it became clear that Ayanna could not survive the winter alone in the wilderness. Jacob offered to let her stay in his cabin until spring, when she could decide what she wanted to do next. She accepted gratefully, though she insisted on contributing to their shared life by cooking, mending his clothes, and helping with other tasks around the cabin. Their daily routine developed gradually. Jacob would check his trap lines and tend to necessary outdoor work, while Ayanna maintained the cabin and prepared meals. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, continuing their language lessons and sharing stories about their different worlds. Jacob learned that Ayanna was not just intelligent, but well-educated by the standards of her people. She knew traditional Apache medicine, could identify and use dozens of medicinal plants, and was skilled in various crafts. She had learned English from missionaries and traders, and could read well enough to help him understand passages in his books when his own reading proved difficult. In return, Jacob taught her about trapping, mountain survival, and the kind of practical skills that had helped him survive alone for 3 years. She was a quick learner and seemed to enjoy mastering new abilities. As they spent more time together, Jacob found himself thinking less about his self-imposed isolation and more about the companionship he had been missing. Ayanna's presence brought warmth to the cabin that had nothing to do with the fire. Her quiet laughter, her careful way of listening, and her gentle comments on his stories made him realize how much he had been talking to himself during his years alone. For her part, Ayanna seemed to blossom as she recovered her health and found herself in a safe environment. The wariness that had marked her first weeks around his cabin gradually gave way to a more relaxed demeanor. She smiled more often, asked questions about his books and his past, and began to express opinions about things they discussed. One evening in late December, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Ayanna asked him something that had clearly been on her mind for some time. "Why you alone?" she asked in her improving English. "Good man. Why no wife, no family?" Jacob considered how to answer. Their communication had grown sophisticated enough for more complex conversations, but this was still difficult territory. "War changed me," he finally said. "Saw too much killing. Hurt too much. Wanted quiet." She nodded thoughtfully. "But now? Still want only quiet?" The question cut straight to something Jacob had been trying not to think about. The truth was that he no longer wanted to be completely alone. Her presence had awakened something in him that he had thought was permanently buried under the weight of war and loss. "No," he admitted. "Now want..." He struggled for words that would express what he felt without presuming too much. "Want friend, want company, want someone to share quiet with." Ayanna smiled at his careful phrasing. "I understand. I also tired of alone." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both staring into the fire and thinking about what they had admitted to each other. Finally, Ayanna spoke again. "Jacob, I tell you something. When I watch you from forest, I see you are different man. You put out food, but more than that. You try speak my language, you show respect. Most white men, they think Apache are animals. You see person." Jacob felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the fire. "You are person, good person, smart person. Apache or not Apache doesn't matter." "Matters to many people," Ayanna said quietly. "White people, Apache people. Both sides have anger. She was right, and Jacob knew it. The relationship that was developing between them would be viewed with suspicion or worse by most people, regardless of which side they belonged to. White settlers would see him as a traitor for harboring an Apache woman. Her own people would likely view her association with a white man as another betrayal of tribal customs. "What you think about that?" he asked. Ayanna was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm with decision. "I think world changing. Old ways, they not working anymore. Apache must learn new ways to survive. White men must learn Apache are people, not enemies. Maybe some of us show others how to live together." The conversation continued late into the night, touching on subjects neither of them had expected to discuss when winter had first brought them together. They talked about the future, about the changes happening across the Western territories, and about what role people like them might play in those changes. By the time they went to bed, something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer just two isolated people sharing shelter for convenience. They had begun to imagine a different kind of life, one that neither of them could have conceived of alone. The next morning brought news that would test their growing bond. Jacob was outside splitting wood when he heard riders approaching through the snow. 3 men on horseback emerged from the tree line, and Jacob recognized them as townspeople from Pine Ridge. Their leader was Tom Bradley, a rancher who had strong opinions about Apache and their place in the territory. Jacob set down his axe and walked toward them, noting their serious expressions and the fact that all 3 were armed. This was not a social visit. "Morning, Tom. What brings you up here in this weather?" Bradley dismounted, his eyes scanning the area around the cabin. "Jacob, we've had reports of Apache sign in this valley. Tracks in the snow, signs of someone camping in the area. We're checking with all the isolated homesteads to make sure everyone's safe." Jacob felt his heart rate increase, but kept his voice steady. "Haven't seen any trouble myself. What kind of sign are you talking about?" "Moccasin tracks near Willow Creek. Old Charlie Blackwood found them 2 days ago. Could be a scouting party. Could be someone planning to hole up for the winter and raid come spring." Bradley's expression was grim. "We're forming a patrol to search the area. You seen anything unusual?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jacob was acutely aware that Ayanna was inside the cabin, probably listening to every word of this conversation. He was also aware that these men would not hesitate to harm her if they discovered her presence, regardless of her individual actions or character. "Can't say that I have," Jacob said carefully, "but I appreciate you letting me know to keep my eyes open." One of the other men, a young hothead named Pete Morrison, spoke up. "We ought to search all the cabins just to be sure. Apache are clever about hiding." Bradley nodded slowly. "That's not a bad idea. Mind if we take a look around, Jacob?" "Just to be thorough." Jacob's mind raced. There was no way to refuse without arousing suspicion, but there was also no way to hide Ayanna's presence if they searched the cabin thoroughly. Her belongings were inside, her moccasins were by the door, and the smell of the herbal tea she favored would be obvious to anyone who entered. "Of course," he said, hoping his voice sounded normal. "Come on in. Though I should warn you, I've been fighting off a fever for the past few days. Might still be catching." It was a weak excuse, but it might discourage a thorough search. As they walked toward the cabin, Jacob's mind was working frantically, trying to think of any way to protect Ayanna from what was about to happen. When Bradley opened the cabin door, the first thing he saw was a woman's dress hanging near the fireplace to dry. His hand dropped immediately to his gun. "Well, Jacob," he said slowly, "looks like you've been keeping some interesting company." Jacob's blood ran cold as Bradley's eyes fixed on Ayanna's dress hanging by the fireplace. The 3 men stepped into the cabin with their hands near their weapons, their faces hard with suspicion and anger. Jacob moved carefully, positioning himself between them and the corner where Ayanna had been sitting just moments before. "Where is she, Jacob?" Bradley's voice was low and dangerous. "Don't even think about lying to us." Jacob's mind raced through his options, none of them good. He could try to claim the dress belonged to someone else, but that would only delay the inevitable. He could try to fight, but 3 armed men against 1 would end badly for everyone involved. Most importantly, he had no idea where Ayanna was hiding, and any sudden moves might put her in greater danger. "Tom, listen to me," Jacob began, keeping his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "This isn't what you think." "Isn't it?" Pete Morrison snapped, drawing his pistol. "You got Apache clothing in here, Jacob. That makes you either a liar or a traitor." Bradley held up a hand to stop Morrison from advancing further, but his own expression remained grim. "Start talking, Rawlins, and it better be good." Jacob took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would determine whether anyone walked out of this cabin alive. "Her name is Ayanna. She's been staying here since she got sick in the snow a few weeks ago. She's not part of any war party, and she's not a threat to anyone." "Apache is Apache," Morrison snarled. "Doesn't matter if it's 1 or a dozen. They're all killers and thieves." "That's enough, Pete." Bradley's voice carried authority, but his eyes never left Jacob's face. "Where is she now?" Before Jacob could answer, a quiet voice spoke from behind them in clear English. "I am here." All 4 men turned toward the door. Ayanna stood in the doorway, having apparently circled around to the front of the cabin while they were inside. She had changed from her traditional dress into some of Jacob's spare clothes, wool pants, a heavy shirt, and his extra coat. With her long black hair tucked under a wool cap, she might have passed for a young Mexican man at a distance, but up close there was no mistaking her identity. Morrison swung his pistol toward her, but Ayanna showed no fear. She stepped into the cabin with her hands visible and empty, her dark eyes moving from one man to another with calm assessment. "You looking for Apache?" she said, her English careful but clear. "You find 1 Apache woman. Now what you do?" The directness of her question seemed to surprise the 3 men. They had probably expected to find a cowering prisoner or a defiant savage. Instead, they were facing a composed young woman who spoke their language and showed no signs of guilt or aggression. Bradley holstered his weapon but kept his hand near it. "You're coming with us. There's questions need answering about what you're doing in this territory." "What questions?" Ayanna asked. "I tell you now. Save time." "Ayanna, don't," Jacob started to say, but she cut him off with a slight shake of her head. "It's better to speak truth," she said. "No more hiding." She moved to stand beside Jacob, a gesture that was both brave and foolish. It clearly demonstrated their alliance, but it also put them both in the line of fire if shooting started. "My family killed by soldiers 2 years ago," she began, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I have nowhere to go. My tribe say I make too much trouble, so they send me away. I live alone in mountains since summer. When snow comes, I get sick. Jacob helped me. That is all." Morrison laughed harshly. "That's all? You expect us to believe that? Apache don't just get cast out for no reason." "I not say no reason," Ayanna replied. "I say what reason is. I help Mexican trader they want to kill. I teach children to read English. I say Apache must learn new ways or die. Some think this makes me traitor to my people." Bradley studied her face carefully. "You're saying your own tribe threw you out for helping a Mexican and teaching kids to read?" "Yes, and for refusing marriage to drunk man who beats women." The simple honesty of her answers seemed to give Bradley pause. These were not the actions of a hostile scout or a dangerous raider. If anything, they sounded like the choices of someone trying to bridge the gap between 2 worlds. That still doesn't explain what you're doing with him, Morrison said, gesturing toward Jacob with his pistol. Apache woman, white man. That's not natural. Jacob felt anger flare in his chest at Morrison's tone, but Ayanna spoke before he could respond. What is natural? She asked. Natural is Apache and white men kill each other forever? Natural is children starve because parents too proud to learn new ways? Natural is good people live alone because others afraid of what they think? She stepped closer to Jacob, her hand finding his arm. Jacob, good man. He see Apache woman sick in snow, he help. He not ask what tribe, what race, what politics. He see person who need help. Is that not what good people do? The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Bradley and his companions exchanged glances, clearly not having expected this kind of conversation. They had come prepared for a raid or a rescue, not a philosophical debate about race and morality. Finally, Bradley spoke again. Even if all that's true, you can't stay here. There's talk in town about Indian troubles, and having you this close to Pine Ridge is going to cause problems. What kind of problems? Jacob asked, finding his voice again. She's done nothing wrong. She's not part of any hostile band. She's just a person trying to survive. The kind of problems that get people killed, Bradley replied bluntly. There's men in town who shoot first and ask questions later when it comes to Apache. There's others who'd use any excuse to organize raids against the tribes. Having an Apache woman living with a white man gives them all kinds of ammunition. Jacob understood the logic, even as he hated it. Bradley was not necessarily expressing his own views, but describing the reality of frontier politics. Fear and prejudice on both sides had created a situation where even innocent relationships could spark violence. So, what are you suggesting? Jacob asked. She comes with us to town. The sheriff can decide what to do with her. Maybe send her to the reservation. Maybe find her people and return her to them. No. The word came from Jacob with more force than he had intended. She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go. Morrison raised his pistol again. That sounds like you're choosing sides, Rawlins, and you're choosing the wrong side. Pete, put that damn gun down, Bradley ordered. Nobody's shooting anybody here unless they have to. But the younger man's finger remained on the trigger, and his eyes held the kind of hatred that made reasonable solutions impossible. Jacob recognized the look from his war days, the expression of men who had stopped seeing their enemies as human beings. I have idea, Ayanna said quietly. All eyes turned to her. Jacob, you remember what Charlie Blackwood tell you about Apache who marry outside tribe? Jacob nodded slowly, beginning to understand where she was going with this. What if Apache woman marry white man? Then she not Apache problem anymore. She white man's family, white man responsible for her actions. The suggestion hit the room like a physical blow. Marriage between Apache and whites was not unheard of, but it was controversial and often dangerous for both parties. It would solve the immediate problem of Ayanna's tribal status, but it would create a host of new complications. You can't be serious, Morrison said. Marry a squaw? That's disgusting. Jacob's control finally snapped. He took a step toward Morrison, his hands clenched into fists. Watch your mouth when you talk about her. Easy, Jacob, Bradley said, moving between them. Fighting isn't going to solve anything. He turned to Ayanna. Are you talking about a real marriage or just a legal arrangement? Ayanna looked directly at Jacob, her dark eyes searching his face. That depend on Jacob. I not force marriage on man who not want me. But if he willing, then yes. Real marriage. Apache woman can love white man same as white woman can. The cabin fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. Morrison's hostility remained, but Bradley seemed to be genuinely considering the proposal. Jacob found himself looking into Ayana's eyes and seeing not just a solution to their immediate problem, but an answer to questions he had been afraid to ask himself. "Ayana," he said slowly, "are you sure about this? Marriage it's permanent, and it won't be easy. There will be people who never accept it." "I know," she said simply, "but Jacob, I already choose you when I come to your cabin instead of staying in forest to die. I already choose you when I tell my story instead of running away. Question is, do you choose me?" Jacob felt something shift inside his chest, like a door opening after being locked for years. The woman standing before him had shown more courage, wisdom, and compassion than most of the people he had known in his life. She had been cast out by her own people for trying to build bridges between worlds, and now she was offering to build one more bridge, this one directly to him. "Yes," he said, the word coming easier than he had expected. "Yes, I choose you." Morrison made a disgusted sound, but Bradley held up his hand for silence. "If you're serious about this, we need to do it right. Legal marriage witnessed and recorded. That way, there's no question about her status." "Can we do that in Pine Ridge?" Jacob asked. "Judge Morrison comes through once a month. He'll be there next week for court sessions. He can perform the ceremony if you're both willing to swear it's voluntary." Jacob looked at Ayana, who nodded firmly. "We're willing." Bradley studied them both for a long moment, then seemed to reach a decision. "All right, here's what we're going to do. You two come down to town with us now. Ayana can stay with my wife until the judge arrives. That way everyone can see that she's under protection and not a threat. And if someone in town decides they don't like having an Apache woman around," Jacob asked, "then they'll have to go through me," Bradley said firmly. "I may not understand this, but I can see that she's not a raider or a spy. And frankly, we've got enough real problems without creating new ones." Morrison started to object, but Bradley cut him off. "That's final, Pete. We came up here to deal with a potential Apache threat. We found one Apache woman who wants to become part of this community instead of fighting it. I call that a victory." The next hour was spent packing essential belongings and preparing for the journey to Pine Ridge. Ayana gathered her few possessions while Jacob assembled supplies for an extended stay in town. The atmosphere remained tense, but the immediate threat of violence had passed. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Jacob took one last look around the place that had been his refuge for 3 years. Everything was about to change, just as the title of their story had promised. The solitary life he had built was ending, but something new and unexpected was beginning. Ayana stood beside him in the doorway, no longer the mysterious shadow at the forest edge, but a woman ready to step into an uncertain future with him. "You sure about this?" he asked her quietly. She smiled, the expression lighting up her face in a way that made his heart race. "Jacob, I've been watching you for weeks. I see how you live, how you treat animals, how you care for land. I see you put food for stranger, learn new language, help sick person. You think I'm not sure about man like that?" The journey to Pine Ridge took most of the day, with the group traveling carefully through the snow-covered mountain trails. Word of their arrival spread quickly through the small town, and by evening, most of the residents had heard about the Apache woman who wanted to marry the hermit from Granite Creek. Reactions were mixed. Some people were curious and generally supportive, especially after meeting Ayana and hearing her story. Others were skeptical or openly hostile, viewing any Apache presence as a threat regardless of circumstances. A few, led by men like Pete Morrison, organized opposition to the marriage and demanded that Ayana be removed from the territory entirely. Sarah Bradley, Tom's wife, proved to be a valuable ally. She was a practical woman who judged people by their actions rather than their ancestry, and she quickly developed respect for Ayana's intelligence and determination. Under Sarah's protection, Ayanna was able to spend the week before the judge's arrival, learning about the customs and expectations of white frontier society. Jacob, meanwhile, found himself dealing with questions and challenges from townspeople who wanted to understand his motivations. Some accused him of being addled by loneliness or bewitched by an exotic woman. Others questioned his loyalty to his own race. A few, however, recognized the courage it took to stand up for someone whom society had rejected. The most important conversation came with Charlie Blackwood, who sought Jacob out on the third day of their stay in town. "You sure you know what you're doing, son?" the old scout asked as they sat in Murphy's store, sharing coffee and avoiding the curious stares of other customers. "Honestly, Charlie, I'm not sure about anything except that she's a good woman who deserves better than what life has given her so far." Blackwood nodded slowly. "I've talked to her some over the past few days. She's smart, and she understands what she's getting into. That marriage certificate is going to protect her in some ways, but it's also going to make both of you targets for people who don't like mixing of the races. What would you do in my place?" The old man was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. "I've lived on the frontier for 40 years, Jacob. Seen a lot of hate and a lot of killing over things that don't really matter when you get down to it. Color of a person's skin, which side of a river they were born on, what language their mama spoke to them." He looked up, meeting Jacob's eyes directly. "I've also seen that the people who survive and thrive out here are the ones who judge folks by what they do, not what they look like. If you love her and she loves you, and if you're both willing to work together to build something good, then that's more than most marriages start with." When Judge Morrison arrived the following week, a small crowd had gathered in the town's meeting hall for the ceremony. The judge, a stern but fair man in his 60s, had been briefed on the situation and had agreed to perform the marriage after interviewing both Jacob and Ayanna separately to ensure that both were acting voluntarily. The ceremony itself was simple but moving. Jacob and Ayanna stood before the judge, surrounded by the mixed crowd of supporters, skeptics, and curious onlookers. They exchanged vows in both English and Apache, a gesture that surprised and pleased many of those present. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, the applause was scattered but genuine. Tom and Sarah Bradley were among the first to congratulate them, followed by Charlie Blackwood and Sean Murphy. Even some of those who had been skeptical seemed moved by the obvious sincerity of the couple's commitment to each other. Pete Morrison and his supporters left without a word, but their absence seemed to lighten the mood rather than darken it. That evening, the newlyweds returned to Jacob's cabin to begin their married life. The journey up the mountain trail felt different than it had a week earlier. They were no longer a lone man and a displaced woman seeking shelter together. They were partners in a new kind of life that neither of them had imagined possible. As they sat by their fireplace that first night as a married couple, Ayanna reflected on the changes that had brought them to this moment. "When I first see you," she said, "I think you just strange white man who live alone because he not like people. I watch to see if you dangerous." "And what do you think now?" Jacob asked, putting his arm around her shoulders. "Now I think you alone because you waiting. You not know what you waiting for, but you waiting. And I think maybe I waiting too, even though I not know it." Jacob considered this. It was true that his years in the mountains had felt like a pause between two parts of his life rather than a permanent retreat from the world. He had needed the solitude to heal from the war and to figure out who he wanted to be when the healing was done. "What do you think we should do now?" he asked. "Stay here in the mountains or try to be part of the town?" Ayanna was quiet for a moment, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "I think we need to be part of both. Mountains for peace, town for community. Show people that Apache woman and white man can live good life together. Maybe help others see that different people can be friends instead of enemies." It was an ambitious goal, and Jacob knew it would not be easy. There would always be people like Pete Morrison, who saw racial mixing as a threat to their way of life. There would be challenges from both sides, as well as practical difficulties in navigating the complex social rules of frontier society. But as he looked at his new wife, Jacob felt optimistic about their chances. Ayanna had already proven that she could adapt to new circumstances while maintaining her own identity and values. She had shown courage in leaving her tribe, wisdom in choosing to trust him, and strength in facing down armed men who saw her as an enemy. Over the following months, their marriage proved to be a success, both personally and politically. Ayanna quickly became a valued member of the Pine Ridge community, contributing her knowledge of herbal medicine, her skills as a seamstress, and her ability to serve as a translator when other Apache individuals occasionally passed through the territory. Jacob found that marriage had given him something he had not realized he was missing, a sense of purpose beyond simple survival. Together, they worked to improve their mountain home. But they also spent time in town helping to resolve conflicts and build understanding between different groups. The most significant change came the following spring, when a small band of Apache approached Pine Ridge under a flag of truce. Their leader was looking for Ayanna, having heard rumors that she was living among the white settlers. When he found her happily married and integrated into the community, he asked if she would be willing to serve as an intermediary in peace negotiations. The talks that followed were difficult and sometimes heated, but they ultimately resulted in a formal peace agreement between the local Apache bands and the settlers of Pine Ridge. Ayanna's marriage had proved that cooperation was possible, and her success in the white community demonstrated that Apache people could adapt to changing circumstances without losing their essential identity. Years later, when Jacob and Ayanna had children of their own and their cabin had grown into a proper homestead, visitors would ask about how their unusual partnership had begun. They would tell the story of the shadow at the window, the gradual building of trust, and the moment when everything changed. But the real story, they both knew, was not about a mysterious woman watching a cabin, or even about a dramatic confrontation with suspicious townspeople. The real story was about two people who had been hurt by the world finding each other and choosing to build something new together. It was about the courage to reach across differences of race and culture to find common ground in simple human decency and love. The lone rider had indeed seen her shadow at his cabin each night. But what had changed everything was not the mystery of her presence, but the revelation that sometimes the thing you think you want least, the end of your carefully constructed solitude, is actually the beginning of the life you never knew you needed.